Hey, what's happening, everybody? I hope you're all having a fantastic day out there. I want to start off by saying thanks, as always, for stopping by the channel. I hopefully have a fun video lined up for you today. Avengers Endgame is now out in theaters. It's, I guess you could say, sort of a benchmark movie in the MCU. I haven't done a ranking video in a handful of films, so here we are. We're going to blow through all 22 of these movies, including Avengers Endgame, from least favorite to my favorite, of course, because it makes no sense to go from the top and work your way down, does it? Now, be warned, there are going to be some spoilers as I talk about these movies, so if there's any you haven't seen, go do so, then come back. Also, these are my opinions. My list may be much different than yours. I just feel the need to say that in the event someone loses their shit over some of my selections down in the comments. So let's have some fun, let's get cozy, let's kick our feet up, and let's break down these movies.
Coming in at number 22, Thor.
Now, all the MCU movies are pretty good. I mean, coming in last on the list isn't a bad thing. It's definitely not a good thing. There are some positives with this fourth movie in the MCU. I really did enjoy some of the action sequences. I thought it was a good time to see Thor with his hammer in hand in action on the big screen. I also enjoyed many of the tie-ins with the other films that this one had. A connected universe of blockbuster comic book movies was still relatively fresh back then and unknown, so for me it was one of the more unique elements of the movie. On the downside, though, the story itself was kind of forgettable in my opinion, with just a unappealing story arc that brought things down to earth. I know it was needed for the overall world building, but it was just highly generic in my opinion. The fish out of water humor was laughable at times, but it was just not impressive by any means. The main storyline just kind of felt overly formulaic, and despite a honestly charming performance from Hiddleston, the rest of the cast overall was lacking a ton of energy, something that was very noticeable in the uninspired romantic subplot with Portman's Jane Foster.
Coming in at number 21, Thor: The Dark World.
These days, Hemsworth as Thor is one of my favorite characters in the MCU, but that was not always the case. I think in these first two movies that Hemsworth felt very stiff and just unenthusiastic in the role. The sequel was a step up and much better, but he still was just lacking a lot of personality. The storyline of these dark elves was serviceable, but honestly extremely forgettable. The added attempts at humor just did not work for me either. I thought they felt clunky. Portman's character almost felt intentionally dumbed down, and the comic relief from Kat Dennings just felt surprisingly elementary for such a big budget project. On the bright side, though, I thought the cast was pretty solid overall. Everybody brought in great performances. I enjoyed the continued relationship development and just the dynamics between Loki and Thor. It was compelling to see evolve in this movie. The action set pieces, they were fun. They were much larger in scope to capture more of Thor's true abilities. It was also awesome to see Anthony Hopkins and Rene Russo continue on in their roles, but with a lackluster third act, to be honest, and a villain in Malekith that you knew was never going to do anything. This movie just lacked a lot of authenticity. There was no weight to anything, and it just had a strong studio personality.
Coming in at number 20 is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2.
I would say the first Guardians was easily the one that surprised me out of all the movies in the MCU. I had low expectations for it going in, and it simply blew me away with a fun, vibrant space adventure. Adding Kurt Russell and Sylvester Stallone was a double win for this sequel. I mean, you could not go wrong with an older version of Tango and Cash, but this movie was a disappointment to me, primarily because of just, honestly, relenting humor that frequently undercut the sincerity of the emotional moments throughout this movie from start to finish. The sequel overbloated everything and anything that worked in the first movie, and it was just missing its own legs to stand on. Stallone ended up being in there somewhere, and surprisingly enough, Russell felt overly theatrical in the delivery of his dialogue and didn't do it for me as Ego. This, just added with endless forced humor, pulled me from being able to connect to the heartfelt moments of the storyline. It made it impossible to take seriously when they wanted me to, but it had some fun action sequences. They were well crafted, they were immersive, they were very adrenaline pumping, they were fun to watch, but in my opinion, the group of characters was kind of missing some of their own unique charm that they had in the first movie, and despite all the different story arcs, it was Michael Rooker's Yondu one that really stole the show for me. This movie was vibrant, it was infused with energy from the musical score, but it was also kind of gimmicky and sort of forgettable.
Coming in at number 19, Iron Man 2.
Again, I wouldn't say any of the MCU movies are horrible, they all have some fun to them. I wouldn't class this sequel as a failure either, but it was hindered by a few different things. I think despite some fun action sequences, they didn't really pop, they weren't really woven into a storyline that created stakes for them. Downey Jr. was solid in the role, but the directions they took the character were a little bit over the top. The more I watch this movie, some of his scenes do land genuine charm, some of them just make him simply unlikable. Mickey Rourke as Ivan Vanko had some potential, but I think he was underwritten. I like Sam Rockwell as Justin Hammer. He had a great performance, but he was just kind of lacking true reasoning for why he was in the story other than to fill some generic tropes and to be a comical plot device. But this movie did give us Scarlett Johansson as Black Widow and Don Cheadle as War Machine, and both of them are given some solid moments to shine in the action. I think this movie also gave us a nice good dose of Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury, and despite so many different moving parts in the script, it worked enough, and I also thought the continued world building of everything was effective in building more curiosity to the overall MCU. I loved Black Widow's fight sequence. War Machine and Iron Man battling it out together was a great time. The racetrack sequence was fantastic, but overall this was kind of a case of style over substance, which I gotta say isn't always a bad thing when the mood is calling for it.
Coming in at number 18, Ant-Man and the Wasp.
The first Ant-Man was another movie that surprised me. The more I watch it, the more it grows on me. I thought the chemistry between Rudd and Lily was fantastic, and they carried that over into their performances in this sequel, but there were just too many storylines in this script, and too many of them felt underdeveloped. I thought a lot of the humor did work, but it was also kind of on the excessive side, and sure, it does create that lighter tone that all these Ant-Man movies have, but it was one that was possibly too light because I never feared for my heroes. I do think the action set pieces were well crafted. They were fun to watch. The fight choreography with Evangeline Lilly as the Wasp was fantastic. The best part of the movie, in my opinion, overall. I think the special effects, they're all top of the line, but it was just too much of a Honey, I Shrunk the Kids vibe with the already lighter tone. It didn't work for me. The villain did have some potential, but there was just a lot of lacking development, and while I can't enjoy this movie for what it is, I just felt like it was kind of going through the motions and lacking a lot of genuine intensity that could lure me in.
Coming in at number 17, Avengers Age of Ultron.
I have to say, despite the additions of Vision, Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver, as well as some admittedly nicely framed superhero moments, that this sequel was a surprising letdown, primarily from a storyline aspect. I think the action was fantastic. It was large scale in scope. It never fails to entertain when watching this movie, but it didn't really create a lot of intensity, and the floating city of Sokovia storyline is still kind of a head scratcher. Other than the climactic action, the character arcs are mildly interesting in this film. There was a lot of potential for all these pieces to come together into a solid sequel, but it just didn't live up to it. I really enjoyed the voiceover work from James Spader, but the entire arc of Ultron in this movie was a miss for me. His robotic army did nothing but showcase some set pieces for our heroes to kick ass. It never felt lasting. I mean, Iron Man in his Hulkbuster suit fighting the Hulk was the best sequence in the film, and it was in the middle of the movie. Seeing Ultron barge into the Avengers party to make his presence known really did create a looming tension, but the flashes of greatness that this movie had just failed to materialize into a memorable film.
Coming in at number 16, Doctor Strange.
I have to admit, this movie's kind of hit and miss with me. I enjoy the performances and the special effects, but I think the villain was kind of a letdown like many other MCU villains. I think there was so much more that Mikkelsen could have done in this character had it just been written with more depth. I think the first act in this movie is one of the best origin setups in the MCU thus far. It was an extremely well-crafted introduction to Stephen Strange as he journeys into the realm of the mystic arts. I could feel the pain and desperation, and it just made me very easily able to connect to his character. The problem for me was once Strange gets his powers, the story kind of feels like it goes into autopilot from there and goes through all the motions. There are endless waves of phenomenal visuals in this movie that are loaded with vibrant colors and just rich depth that create that fun cosmic adventure, but as it progresses, it simply feels like it's in that formula, just with a new overcoating. It all leads up to a CG-filled third act that honestly gets a little messy at times, but it's still more than enough fun in my opinion. It's just a little more formulaic on the back half than I was hoping for after loving the first half of the movie so much.
Coming in at number 15, Captain Marvel.
Now, I only saw this movie one time, but I liked it. I thoroughly enjoyed Brie Larson in the role as both Carol Danvers and as Captain Marvel, and felt that she was capable and comfortable in the portrayal of the role. I had a good time with Samuel L. Jackson as a younger Nick Fury. I thought that both he and Larson had a very good chemistry with one another that was appealing to watch. The action sequences were pretty cool. I felt they were able to do a good job of really portraying what this superhero was capable of. The set pieces were very visually appealing. They were climactic. They had me very much up in my seat later on in the film. I think that those leading up to it, though, were on the routine side, sadly, but still fun. I do think the story felt a little bit rushed, though. It almost felt like it was an Origins movie and a Part 2 all in one movie. Things are moving very quickly from start to finish. It ended up leading to some underdevelopment, I would say, in many of the characters. And once again, without a true villain in this movie, that never felt like there were ramifications to anything. And that's something that, being the lead-up film to Avengers Endgame, kind of showed as a limitation from a storytelling aspect, despite having a fun, charming 90s setting that had a lot of possibilities to it.
Coming in at number 14, Iron Man 3.
Now, I probably like this movie more than a lot of people do. I have no doubt that it's probably higher up on my list than most other people's lists, but I enjoy this movie more for its simple story elements than I do for its spectacular comic book action. For me, the appeal in this one is the story arc of Tony Stark suffering from PTSD after the events in New York and the Avengers. This really allowed the performance of Downey Jr. to shine, which was a major step up from Part 2, and I find this exploration of the character to be very intriguing. He was outside of the Iron Man suit much more in this one, and it really worked for me. It was a nice change of pace, and I feel that it was the most complete character study thus far in the MCU. But there is no hiding the flaws in this movie. The complete villain angle was an absolute fiasco. The bait and switch with the Mandarin was like basically sticking a knife in a truck tire and deflating it. I think Guy Pearce could have potentially served as a nice villain, but being the follow-up to a fake Mandarin was just a major setback to anything he could have accomplished in this role as far as leaving an impact. It was a bold move as a story direction, one that I don't think necessarily worked, but there's some fun action in this one and some entertaining new technology to provide some fun comic book action that I think complements the Tony arc story arc nicely.
Coming in at number 13, Spider-Man Homecoming.
I had a great time with this movie, and I loved Holland in the role as both Parker and Spider-Man. I also loved the fresh take on the origin story. The character is back in high school and actually looks like a high school kid. There's just a youthfulness to him that is in this role that I just think both Maguire and Garfield didn't really capture. The humor was very charming and witty. The storyline was fresh and unique, which is a nice change of pace in this age of endless comic book movies. We get to see Peter Parker grow into Spider-Man in different ways than we had before, and I can always appreciate that. And this one also gives us Michael Keaton with a fantastic performance as the Vulture. It was a villain that you could really understand. You could almost relate to him. He didn't have grand goals of destroying the universe, but he had just ominous plans that needed a hero to step in the way to stop them, and it was a great first mission for Spider-Man. He gets his ass handed to him and still comes out on top, and it was a true underdog story that really blended with an origin story, and I can't wait to see more of where this solo franchise goes with Holland in the role.
Coming in at number 12, The Incredible Hulk.
Now, this is another of the MCU movies I have no doubt I am going to like a lot more than many other people. And I mean, sure, Norton in the role breaks the continuity of everything, but it was a great solo film for The Incredible Hulk and one that we needed. The storyline was filled with all the usual origin story tropes, but it was still a solid film filled with a lot of charming comic book action. It may have been a narrative that felt familiar to a lot of other movies, but for me, seeing the Hulk, an all-time favorite character of mine, on the big screen in all his troubled glory was a wild ride that I still enjoy rewatching today. I will admit Liv Tyler didn't really work in this movie all that much, and the overall love angle of the storyline was kind of a miss as well, but there was more than enough compelling storytelling to make up for it in my opinion, primarily with a great performance from Tim Roth as Emil Blonsky, aka the Abomination. I mean, Ross in this movie was very intense. He gave the character true imposing motives and is an underrated villain in the MCU in my opinion. I think the third act in this one may have been stuff that we've all seen many other times in the genre before, but with this character, it was enough to result in a solid film that I think still holds up.
Coming in at number 11, Ant-Man.
The first time I saw this movie, I enjoyed it, but I felt it was just far too cute for my usual taste. I thought Paul Rudd was excellent in the lead. I thought he felt very comfortable in the role. He was able to pull off all the humor with ease and with a nice timing. He was able to feel like a common man, but he also felt very capable when he was called on to be a hero. It was a very traditional origin story with another cut and paste villain, but with the charm of the dialogue and Rudd in particular, I think this was an entertaining film that routinely puts a smile on my face when I go back and rewatch it. The actual comic book action was, yes, on the cute side, but I think it still works for the subject matter. The more I watch this movie, I gotta admit, the more I grow to appreciate just the collection of characters, their personalities, and all their dynamics with one another. There's just an atmosphere about this one that makes up for some of the scaled down action set pieces. I mean, Ant-Man's superhero moments may have lacked some visual intensity, but with some crisp visual effects, it's still a fun adventure. This movie sort of just makes me feel good when watching, despite some of its shortcomings, and sometimes that's exactly what you need, a movie to just put you in a good mood.
Coming in at number 10, Guardians of the Galaxy.
Like I mentioned earlier, this was one of the most surprising movies in the MCU for me. I thoroughly loved the sense of humor that this film captured. I thought it was able to blend perfectly with just the wild, vibrant space adventure that it crafted. It was uncharted territory for Marvel Studios, and it was a fresh film that I think still does stand out for its creativity. It was filled with wild, eccentric characters that I naturally wanted to know more about, and with just endless charming dialogue, the characters became familiar and likable very quickly. I without question think that Chris Pratt commanded the lead role with his Solo-esque take on Star-Lord. He was very charming and charismatic. The rest of the cast was fantastic as well. They all captured the needed chemistry with one another to make up this just vibrant group of personalities. The makeup design and the special effects was able to create an entire new world to immerse the viewer, yet it still connected itself to the overarching story of the MCU. I still think this is one of the most funniest films in the MCU so far. The humor still holds up even after rewatching, yet it never gets in the way of the story. This is just a charismatic roller coaster of entertainment as we get to see how this ragtag group of misfits gets together.
Coming in at number 9, Thor Ragnarok.
Taika Waititi stepped in for this third film in the franchise and completely knocked it out of the park by infusing this movie with spirited characters and just vividly colorful backdrops. The storyline was also injected with just a charming, well-timed sense of humor that complemented the beats of the main plotline perfectly to just constantly engage the viewer in what was happening. I think Thor was much more self-aware in this movie. I think he came into form as Thor in this film. The addition of Hulk was another major bonus for me, and it results in one of the best moments so far in the MCU as Thor and Hulk battle it out in the arena. I do think the Thor films have continually gotten better as this one explores the layers of the God of Thunder, and I think the result was just excellent climactic action. This one was just brimming with endless intensity and loaded with just edginess from an excellent musical score that I felt was as important to this soundtrack as it was to the music in Baby Driver. I mean, plus this one gives us Cate Blanchett as Hela, who I consider to be one of the best MCU villains thus far, as well as Tessa Thompson as Valkyrie, who really shines in her coming out party for the MCU by just delivering an endearing hero with a bright future to come in the MCU movies to come.
Coming in at number 8, Marvel's The Avengers.
This movie was the culmination of 5 films. It was the first of its kind at the time. Seeing all these heroes on screen together was amazing, and it truly brought out the kid in me while I was watching it for the first time. I will admit the storyline felt a little bit on the choppy side as far as progression, but it just didn't hinder the adventure of just seeing the assembling of the Avengers for the very first time. I thought there was a nice balance between all the different characters to really give everybody their moment. The superhero moments were plentiful in this one, and while the films leading up to it were of good quality, I think this was the first ever comic book event film in many decades. I think the entire final act as the Battle of New York ensues is one of the best sequences in the MCU, and it's just a cinematic work of art. The cinematography of all of it was just extremely fluid. Amazing camera work and special effects are on display. The camera flows from one hero to the next with such a smooth flow. It was like a dance of comic book action that never gets old while watching, and going back and watching this entire sequence with the musical score from Alan Silvestri is just hands down an iconic moment, not only in comic book movies, but just in filmmaking, period. Coming
in at number 7, Captain America: The First Avenger.
This is another movie I'm sure many are going to be shocked to see so high up on my list, but I gotta say I stand by it because I think it's a highly underrated comic book movie. It was a film that was able to create its own unique atmosphere with a time period setting that felt like it was just ripped from the pages of comic books to bring it to life. I will admit this movie is lacking in some action set pieces, but the ones that are here will really hit with some impact because I think the story just creates emotional intensity and weight to the events that take place, and it goes without saying that Chris Evans just perfectly was casted in this role and he carried it on his shoulders with ease. I thought there were multiple character arcs that had a very compelling growth to them, and watching Steve Rogers grow into Captain America was an origin story film that, despite some usual tropes, felt like one I had never seen before. The supporting cast was fantastic with names like Tommy Lee Jones, Haley Atwell, and Sebastian Stan all coming in to deliver some rich characters that you can invest in, and last but certainly not least was a very amazing performance from Hugo Weaving as Red Skull, another one of the underrated MCU villains. I mean, the action in this one was much more grounded, but it still was able to create that superhero magic, and I think it really worked into a fun origins underdog story with a backdrop that just does a great job of creating a fun mental escape.
Coming in at number 6, Black Panther.
I wanted to see this film over 2 decades ago with Wesley Snipes in the lead, but it never came to be. We got Blade instead. Chadwick Boseman certainly did the trick because he was excellent as Black Panther. This was also that film in the MCU that felt like it had its own voice and a little bit of a break outside the formula. It fit inside the network of the other films, but very much stood on its own. The story was layered with thought-provoking parallels to build a movie which created its own world while still capturing the true feeling of a character's origin story, and I loved it. This movie also crafts one of the best villains in the MCU, one that was so well written it could easily be classed as an anti-hero or even a hero for the core of his beliefs, and Michael B. Jordan was phenomenal in the role. He elevated the material greatly and he paired with Boseman perfectly. The action was a blend of old world with new age technology, and the contrast was a perfect blend. The cast from top to bottom was amazing with a great string of performances. The third act showdown from a visual aspect was honestly a mild letdown, but it doesn't hinder from an award-worthy storyline and just great performances that steal the show.
Coming in at number 5, Iron Man.
Yes, this may have been the first movie in the MCU, but it's still one of my top 5 favorites, and I will admit to you the overall progression of it is familiar. It did play it safe in terms of the overall story structure, but I think it definitely made up for it with a solidified tone that just created waves of heartfelt emotion. The first act, as we are introduced to Stark and see him battle it out of this cave, was just an amazing introduction. I mean, when he comes out in the Iron Man suit and starts ripping fire through the place, the MCU officially kicked off, and it's only gained more momentum over the years. I'm not alone in thinking that Downey Jr. was world-class in the role. He captured just all the nuances of Tony Stark to give us all we could ask for in a superhero alter ego. His delivery of the dialogue was just perfectly timed to the point where at times it didn't even feel like he was acting when he was portraying Stark. And then as Iron Man, I felt the story really grew him into the role perfectly. I mean, seeing him evolve the tech was very interesting. It was loaded with visual appeal, as was this entire movie. I thought the action sequences were excellent. They captured the capabilities of Iron Man in just stunning fashion to introduce the world to a relatively unknown hero from a relatively scoffed-at actor at the time. Jeff Bridges was fantastic as Obadiah. I think he, without question, took an extremely simplified villain on paper and made the most out of the material. He was very imposing and menacing with his expressions and the way he carried himself about. The delivery of his dialogue felt very calculating, and I think he did all that anybody could have with this material, and he gave the MCU its first solidified villain. I will admit the third act was on the routine side for the genre, but it worked more than enough to complete one of the all-time great origin stories that delivered a ton of just comic book visual, but really surprised with a story that had heart and emotional layering to it.
Coming in at number 4, Avengers Endgame.
This was the culmination of 21 movies, and it did not let down. It was heartfelt and climactic from an emotional aspect, but it was also coupled with some large-scale action sequences that just gave me goosebumps while watching. It was absolutely riveting from start to finish. It felt like there were no loose ends left behind. There was just honestly so much going on in this one, but it was still able to bring closure, but still plants the seeds for new things to come. I think both Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. bring in some sincere performances that after all these movies, we're still able to really capture some layers of these characters that we've never seen before, which was honestly pretty impressive. This film had an endless supply of superhero moments, massive scale climactic action that was tightly choreographed, and it was just brimming with emotional sincerity, but it was also just a little bit cluttered, and many of the characters, in my opinion, were kind of forgotten. I mean, when everyone is tossed into the mix, it felt way too late into the runtime, and I think the balance overall could have been a little bit better, but there was, like I said, so much going on. I also felt like the humor was a little bit too intense and slightly undercut some of the emotional intensity of things. Many of the laughs hit, but some were not so well timed, and they felt a little bit forced, and which was surprising. The death of Stark was really a touching send-off to memorialize the character. I would say the same would go for a Captain America. Admittedly, I have no idea how his story arc really worked out at the end, but the finished result was quaint and perfectly fitted for his character. It was just a nicely crafted scene to pass the shield on to Falcon, so it worked for me. Smart Hulk was also a bit of a miss, as was out-of-shape Thor, but overall the storyline in this one truly was incredible and just the perfect end to this section of the MCU.
Coming in at number 3, Avengers Infinity War.
I love this movie primarily because it's the origin story of a villain, and Thanos was honestly a fantastic one. This movie showed us our heroes broken like we have never seen them before, and it was a breath of fresh air. There was just endless waves of emotion and torment put onto our heroes, and it created some honest, sincere unpredictability. There was a ton of weight and ramifications to things that would happen. The stakes were high from start to finish, and the result was admittedly a compelling exploration of the villain that was the true star of the film. This movie also brought more of our heroes together, and it was the climactic event film that it needed to be. The battle sequence in Wakanda was honestly a work of cinematic excellence, as was the battle with Thanos on Titan. I think these sequences overall were just very visceral. They were fluid, but they still meant something. There was actual doubt to the notion that the heroes would end up safe and sound at the end like they usually are, which just was a different play on the tropes that I can always appreciate. I thought the performances across the board were fantastic as usual. Downey Jr., Holland, Hemsworth, and Saldana, in my opinion, all were the bright spots. As for Thanos, he had been built up for years, and he really did leave his unforgettable stamp on the MCU with this movie. From a conceptual design to the voiceover work from Brolin to the philosophical dialogue, all of it really blended together perfectly to create this true master villain that the movie and this universe of films needed, and it delivers probably one of the most just emotionally taxing third acts in comic book movie history.
Coming in at number 2, Captain America: The Winter Soldier.
I still managed to keep this movie way up on my list because every time I watch it, I still love it as much as I did the first time seeing it in the theater. I think it's one of the most complete movies in the MCU. The storyline is just layered with compelling plot lines that show a smooth, continual pace. The conflict between hero and villain is perfectly framed to deliver not only action-packed sequences, but to also deliver just emotional intrigue. There are many moving pieces, all with their own motives, and the espionage vibe really complements everything perfectly. Most of the action is more grounded in scope, but not at all lacking in intensity. The fight choreography was just excellent. It's tightly woven. It makes it very gritty, but not at all overly stylized. The set pieces really do fit the tone of the story perfectly, and I thought the practical effects are what make this movie the down-to-earth superhero film that it needed to be. It was surprisingly unpredictable at times. It took some creative twists and turns, and in my opinion, it was a lasting film because it was one where the hero wins the battle, but possibly loses the war. And I thoroughly loved this small group of characters together as well. I like the imprint that both Fury and Black Widow leave on this one, and I thought Sebastian Stan was surprisingly fantastic as the mentally fractured Winter Soldier, with Robert Redford being a solid addition as well. This to me was just a nicely blended film that delivers a bit of everything that you could really want in a comic book movie. The Russo brothers really created a nice balance in this storyline, and it was just, in my opinion, riveting from start to finish and surprisingly thought-provoking after it ends.
And coming in at number 1, Captain America: Civil War.
I think this movie might have been my favorite in the MCU since the first time I watched it. I guess you could say it's like love at first sight. It was a storyline that's just woven perfectly with multiple story angles. The character dynamics create drama no matter how many times I watch it. It's one of the weaknesses in the MCU is the villains, and this one really took the heroes, gave them the improper righteous intentions, and pitted them against one another, and I have to say the result was perfect. The battle in the airport to me is the finest sequence in the MCU thus far. It was just a a visual feast for the eyes. It gave me chills when I watch it, and it still does so anytime I see it. The story was able to frame up the Iron Man versus Captain America plotline perfectly, with both Downey Jr. and Evans nailing the delivery. The result to me was one of the best one-on-one showdowns we have seen in the MCU, if not the best, because it was gritty, it was violent, it was brimming with emotional rage, which made it mean so much more. This was another one of those MCU movies that I think gave us our heroes and perspectives that we hadn't seen them before, which is always compelling to watch. Seeing them conflicted about something is a given with every movie, but conflicted with their feelings about one another is something new, and it was riveting to see play out. But if all of that was not enough, this movie also delivers the first appearances in the MCU of both Spider-Man and Black Panther, and I gotta say their placements in the story was extremely well crafted to hit with impact. The chase sequence with Black Panther tailing the Winter Soldier down on the highway is just a thing of beauty. It's a perfect first scene for a superhero, and with Spider-Man we get to see Tom Holland, we get to see the charming personality, the youthful energy, and the web-slinging action, and it's all just amazing to see come together in that airport scene once again. And not only do we get to see the characters, but we also get to see Boseman and Holland in them, which was equally as impressive. And with that, that's why this is my favorite movie in the MCU. And that's my list, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. Also, let me know what your choices would be. Leave me your list, leave me your top 5s, your top 10s, whatever you guys want to do. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm gonna go get a drink of water and take a nap. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, drop it a thumbs up, leave a comment below. I'd love to talk movies with you guys. Share it with your friends, and without question, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you can never miss a video. Here are some links to some recent reviews just in case you missed them. All my social media links and the link to our official website are down in the description below, and I'll catch you next time.